This is the screencast for 1970s to present global theme, and you are going to be asked to identify these terms from the decade they're from, and then a brief summary. That's what you'll be assessed on. This one comes up a couple times. It's OPEC and the oil shortage. And what I want you to think about here is since World War II, when the state of Israel was created, all of the surrounding Arab states attacked Israel. And by the time we get to the 1970s, after losing a series of wars like the Yom Kippur War, the Six Day War, a group of Arab states that have oil decide to create the organization of OPEC. And what they're trying to do is get the world to recognize and come up with a solution to the Israeli Palestinian crisis. In the United States, we talked about the Iran hostage crisis during the Cold War when the United States supported the Shah. And the support of the Shah angered the people of Iran. And in 79, Ayatollah Khomeini led a revolution. And that revolution led to a situation where the former leader, the Shah of Iran, fled by plane to the United States and trying to hold him accountable for crimes against the Iranian people. Students stormed the U.S. Embassy, as you see in this photograph here, and took U.S. hostages for about a year. Back to another issue connected to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the Munich Olympics 1972, where an organization called Black September, advocating for the Palestinians as well as Arab nationalism and trying to get Israel to release terrorists, decided to capture the Israeli Olympic team, and then these individuals wound up getting executed. This is a famous photograph from that particular event. And as I mentioned before, there was a series of wars. By the time you get from the end of World War II all the way up until the 1970s, there starts to grow this anger by some people on the Arab side, where they start to resort to terrorism because efforts to go to the United Nations and fighting through wars like the Yom Kippur War were unsuccessful. And you start to then see this wave of terrorism that starts to emerge. In 78, the United States would try to broker peace between the Arab and Israeli side. And this led to the Camp David Accords, where Egypt formally recognized the independence or the state of Israel, which of course led to additional anger. And then that anger led to more groups acting against Israel and then later even against Egypt, which we can see in this image here. I started out with the Camp David Accord, which led to anger. This individual was a member of an organization, EIJ, Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And as a result of Egypt recognizing Israel, eventually they would execute the leader of Egypt, Sadat, and some of the members of EIG would flee, and they would end up in Afghanistan during the Soviet war with Afghanistan. And if we don't recall, Abdullah Azzam, bin Laden's mentor, advised Muslims to travel to Afghanistan so they could fight against the Soviet Union. Bin Laden had left Saudi Arabia and traveled to Afghanistan. When he made it to Afghanistan, other members from Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, also left their countries. And before you know it, you start to see the formation of Al Qaeda. These circles represent members of Al Qaeda that were participants in the Soviet Afghan War, members of the organization called Muslim Brotherhood. And here's Abdullah Azzam, bin Laden's mentor, and all of them would have an influence on the 9/11 hijackers. When we're looking at the 9/11 hijackers, I always want to make sure that there is a distinction. Here we see the two sects in Islam, Shia Sunni, and as a result of reform movements and interpretation of Islam, there starts to develop this, I'm going to call it a new version of Islam, and that is one that is interpreted by bin Laden. So it's one thing to be a Muslim, it's another thing to be a Muslim buying into Osama bin Laden's interpretation of the Quran. Here we have yet another incident involving Israel, and this one involves Israel and its northern border, Lebanon, where there's a series of engagements between the two sides. The United States sends a peacekeeping force into Lebanon, and before you know it, there is a Marine barracks that is attacked, and a terrorist attack to try to get the United States out of Lebanon, as well as to get some sort of peace to the crisis in the Middle East. And in that incident, Sean Essler, a South Brunswick High School graduate, would die. This slide, we're going back to the Vietnam War. In 1975, the United States left Vietnam as well as Cambodia. We had addressed this a little bit more in the Cold War. Don't forget that the United States and the Soviet Union were trying to figure out a way to reduce armaments. That's what this image right here is about. We looked at this during the Cold War, where they were trying to reduce treaty or nuclear weaponry by the SALT Treaty. And at the end of the day, neither side really complied. Is the image of the U.S. evacuation from Vietnam. This is the U.S. Embassy, and these are Vietnamese trying to get on these helicopters so they could eventually make it to the United States. Keep in mind that when the United States left Vietnam and then Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge would come to power in Cambodia and then implement what would become known as the Cambodian Genocide. The Berlin Wall starts to come down in 1989. If you were to look at this link right here, it would talk about these reform policies that were put in place in the Soviet Union to ease restrictions, to kind of get away from a dictatorship. And this link is interesting because this politician is reading an order about the Berlin Wall, the difference between East and West Berlin. And while he's at this press conference, he talks about the new law, but he's asked whether or not it means that people can travel between East and West Berlin immediately, to which he responds yes. And as a result of his error and misinterpretation of the law, it led to a situation where Germans or Berliners decided to go to the wall, and before you know it, it led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was the symbol for the Cold War, indicating that the Cold War was now over. By the time you get into the 1980s, Iran and Iraq would engage in a war. Keep in mind that Iran has the hostages, so the United States has a terrible relationship with Iran, which is why the United States supported Iraq. And this is going to come back later in the 90s to be a problem. In the early 80s, this was a match in the Olympics between the United States and Soviet Union. It's called the Miracle on Ice because it was an example of the United States' triumph win over the Soviet Union during the Olympics. Once again, during the Cold War, another issue involving the Iran-Contra affair. Remember that the Congress passed a regulation against the CIA that said they could no longer get involved in politics, assassinations, and things like that. They pretty much put limits on the CIA. And when Iraq and Iran were in a war, there was also a hostage crisis going on in Lebanon. Iran versus Iraq was over here, and there was some fighting going on in Nicaragua between the communist and the capitalist side there. And this was a deal that was made presumably by Oliver North. And if you believe in the deal basically said that the United States would sell weapons to Iran, and then those weapons would, the money for the weapons would go to Nicaragua, bypassing the CIA restriction, and then Iran would negotiate with Lebanon because there was also a hostage crisis in Lebanon. When the President of the United States, Reagan, was asked about it, he denied having any knowledge about this particular incident, which led to the Iran-Contra affair. Tiananmen Square is a protest going on in China, and it's about this guy right here, Tank Man. The Chinese government sends in the military to crush a protest, and Tank Man becomes a symbol of fighting for freedom and democracy, because when you look at the clip, the tanks decide not to run this human being over, and he's credited with preventing possible massacre. Unlike in Rwanda in the 1990s, when there was a civil war going on between the Hutu and the Tutsis in Rwanda, and when President Habyarimana's plane was shot down, this led to anger, and the Hutu population went out and implemented a genocide on the Tutsi population. Remember, the United Nations has an obligation to stop genocide, but when asked about the United Nations reps and U.S. reps refer to it as ethnic cleansing, and ethnic cleansing is not genocide, therefore you cannot get involved in that particular incident. Here we see some documents about the Rwandan genocide. As I said before, the United States helped to arm Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, and by the time you get to the 1990s, Saddam Hussein would take his military from Iraq into the country of Kuwait, which led to a crisis where the United Nations sent a military force. One place the military force was located, into Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden took anger to this because, in his view, only Muslims should defend Saudi Arabia, which is home to Mecca and Medina, which led to the evolution of Al-Qaeda's ideology in the 90s. When Saddam Hussein was kicked out of Kuwait, he did a pretty nasty tactic by setting the oil reserves on fire. Again, Iraq invaded the country of Kuwait. The United Nations with the U.S. sent the military here, forced his army back into Iraq, and while he was retreating, he set their oil reserves on fire. If you were not aware, going back to the sphere of influence, Hong Kong sovereignty was transferred back to China, And this really has its origins back into the late 1800s with the open door policy regarding China, where European powers carved up China using spheres of influence. Another example of ending imperialism was when the United States gave Panama back to the Panama Canal. Again, this is an incident that took place in the late 1800s where the United States was given the authority to control the canal. And that treaty expired, as it indicates right here. In 1993, before Al Qaeda was a thing, a man by the name of Ramzi Youssef, who was related to someone named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who eventually would plan the 9/11 attacks, tried to blow up the original Trade Center. And that is one of the incidents that show pretty much the direction of the 1990s of where Al Qaeda eventually was going to end up. In 93, that happened. In 98, bin Laden wrote his fatwa, which is official declaration on the West, mainly the United States. And getting closer to 9/11 in 1998, you see the Africa embassies attacked, U.S. embassies in Africa attacked. In 2000, the USS Cole was bombed. Bin Laden would officially take, um, the admit to committing this particular attack in the name of an organization called Al Qaeda. And then before you know it, we would get to the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 hijackers. Some of them were here 2 years prior to 9/11. And after 9/11, the United States would send the military once again to Iraq. An organization called Al Qaeda in Iraq emerged, led by this guy right here, Mossad. And once this individual was killed, there was a split between Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda in Iraq. And the Al Qaeda in Iraq split led to the formation of ISIS. And that's it for the global themes.